She leveled the shotgun at his chest and said the name that was no longer his to use. "My name is Lenora Kincaid. You are trespassing on my land. Leave." 2 months ago, she had stepped off a stagecoach with $12 and nothing else. This is the story of how she found everything. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting on the boardwalk. No warm smile beneath a wide-brimmed hat. No hand extended to help her down the steps the way the letters had promised, the way she had imagined every night for 3 weeks as the miles between her old life and this unknown future grew wider and more terrifying with every passing hour. What Lenora Winslow found instead, standing in the afternoon light of a small Colorado mountain town called Ridgercross, were 3 men, 3 enormous men. They stood beside a heavy freight wagon near the general store, all of them taller than any man she had ever seen in Columbus, Ohio. Broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, wearing work clothes that had been washed but never quite freed of the dust and labor ground into the fabric. 2 of them watched her with open curiosity. The third, the tallest, the oldest, with eyes the color of aged whiskey and a scar running the length of his jaw, watched her with something else entirely. Something guarded and reluctant and almost pained, as though her arrival confirmed a fear he had been carrying for weeks. 3 men, not one. The advertisement had said one rancher, one man seeking one wife. Lenora's fingers tightened around the crumpled letter in her hand, the same letter she had read so many times the folds were wearing through, and she felt the ground tilt beneath her feet the way it had when she first learned about her father's debts, the way it had when Victor Hale told her she belonged to him now, the way the world always tilted when everything she believed turned out to be a lie. Before she could retreat back into the stagecoach and beg the driver to take her anywhere else, a stout woman with steel gray hair and a flour-dusted apron pushed past the 3 giants and descended the boardwalk steps with surprising speed. "Miss Winslow," the woman said, and her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. "I'm Agnes Pruitt. We've been corresponding." Lenora recognized the name. Agnes Pruitt had written every letter, had described the ranch in the mountains, had assured her that Mr. Kincaid was a good man, who had been alone too long, had promised that Colorado would be the fresh start Lenora so desperately needed. Agnes Pruitt had also apparently left out several rather important details. "Mrs. Pruitt," Lenora managed, and she was proud that her voice held steady, even though her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. "The advertisement mentioned one rancher. I count 3. Agnes had the grace to look slightly sheepish, but she did not apologize. Not yet. Instead, she took Lenora's arm with a gentleness that felt almost maternal and said, "Those are the Kincaid brothers, Silas Merritt and Boone. They share the ranch." A pause. "I may have simplified things in my letters." "Simplified," Lenora repeated, and the word tasted hollow. "I know this isn't what you expected. And if you want to turn right around and get back on that stage, nobody will stop you. But I am asking you to give it one day. Just one. See the ranch. Meet them properly. Decide for yourself." Agnes squeezed her arm. "After that, it's entirely your choice." Lenora looked at the stagecoach. The driver was already unhitching the fresh team preparing for the return trip to Denver. She looked at the 3 brothers who had not moved, had not spoken, who stood like mountains themselves against the backdrop of actual mountains rising in every direction, snow still clinging to the highest peaks, despite the warmth of the valley below. She thought about Victor Hale. She thought about the $12.30 remaining in her reticule money that would not get her halfway back to Denver. She thought about the fact that she had no family left who could take her and no skills that would earn a living in a frontier town, no options that did not end in either destitution or surrender. One day. She could survive one day of anything. "All right," Lenora said, "one day." And she stepped toward the wagon. "If you are new here, welcome. I share frontier stories every week, and each one is meant to stay with you long after it ends. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. I want to see how far Lenora's story travels. Now, let us ride." The road from Ridgecross to the Kincaid Ranch wound upward through country that looked like God had painted it with a reckless hand. Stands of aspen and pine crowded the hillsides, their shadows long in the late afternoon light. The air thinned as they climbed, carrying scents Lenora had never known in Ohio. Pine resin and Coal Creek water, and something else, something vast and clean, that she would later learn was simply the smell of altitude of wilderness, of a world that had not been tamed. Lenora sat on the wagon bench between Agnes and the middle brother Merritt, who drove the team with an easy confidence that suggested he had traveled this road 1,000 times and could do it blindfolded. The other two brothers rode alongside on horseback. Silas slightly ahead, scanning the terrain the way a soldier scans a battlefield. Boone slightly behind, hat pulled low, watching Lenora with an expression that bordered on hostility. During that hour-long ride, Lenora formed her first impressions of each brother, and those impressions would prove both accurate and incomplete in the weeks to come. Silas Kincaid rode like a man who expected trouble from every direction and intended to meet it head-on. He sat his horse with military precision, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes never resting on any single point for more than a few seconds before moving to the next. He was 43 years old, though the years sat heavier on him than they should have carved into the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. The scar along his jaw caught the fading sunlight when he turned his head, and Lenora found herself wondering what blade or bullet had put it there, and whether the wound that gave it to him had hurt less than whatever wound he carried on the inside. He had spoken exactly one sentence since her arrival. When Agnes introduced Lenora, Silas had looked at the older woman with something between anger and resignation and said flatly, "You should have told her the truth." Then nothing. Not a word of welcome, not a nod of acknowledgement. Just those whiskey-colored eyes, unreadable and watchful. And then he turned his horse and rode ahead as though putting distance between himself and a situation he wanted no part of. Merritt was different. Merritt Kincaid was the first of the three brothers to make Lenora feel something other than terror. He had warm, amber eyes with laugh lines at the corners, a strong jaw, clean of beard, and a voice that carried natural warmth without tipping into false familiarity. He pointed out landmarks as they climbed. The creek where the best trout gathered in deep pools below the falls. The ridge where elk came to graze at first light, sometimes 200 strong, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. The old lightning-split pine that marked the boundary of Kincaid land, a tree so massive it had taken 3 men to reach around its trunk before the bolt struck. "Are you hungry?" Merritt asked at one point, and when Lenora hesitated, too proud to admit she had not eaten since yesterday, he read her silence the way a man reads weather, and said, "Agnes has been cooking since before dawn. She has made enough food to feed a cavalry regiment and will be personally offended if you do not eat until you cannot move. Just so you know what you are walking into." It was such a small kindness, such a simple thing. But Lenora had received so few kindnesses in the past 3 months that this one settled into her chest like a warm coal and stayed there glowing faintly for the rest of the day. Boone Kincaid was the youngest at 33, and he said nothing at all during the ride. He rode behind the wagon with his hat brim pulled low and his posture radiating the kind of coiled, barely contained energy that Lenora associated with animals who had not yet decided whether to fight or flee. Every time she glanced back, she found him staring at her with those striking green hazel eyes, and the look in them was not cruelty, but something closer to suspicion. The wariness of a man who had learned the hard way that new things brought new problems, and the safest course was to trust nothing until it proved itself. When Merritt made a joke about Agnes's cooking, Boone did not laugh. When Agnes pointed out wildflowers blooming along the roadside, Boone did not look. He was a wall of silence and resistance, and Lenora could feel his opposition to her presence radiating from 10 feet away like heat from a stove. Agnes sat beside Lenora and occasionally patted her hand, a gesture of reassurance that was both comforting and insufficient. Agnes knew she had created this situation. She had placed the advertisement without telling the brothers the full truth. She had selected Lenora from among dozens of respondents. She had orchestrated this meeting the way a general orchestrates a campaign, with strategic patience and a willingness to accept casualties. The reasons Lenora would learn later went deeper than matchmaking. The ranch appeared as they crested a final ridge, and despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion, and the 3 strange men, and the $12 standing between her and absolute ruin, Lenora's breath caught in her throat. The Kincaid Ranch sat in a high mountain valley that looked like something torn from a storybook and set down in the real world by mistake. A sturdy timber house with a wide wraparound porch faced south toward a creek that caught the last of the daylight and turned it into a ribbon of molten gold. Behind the house rose a massive barn, gray with age but solid as stone, flanked by several outbuildings, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and corrals where horses stood in the amber light, their coats gleaming. Mountains climbed skyward on three sides thick with pine forest, the highest peaks still crowned with snow that would not melt until July. The valley floor was green with late spring grass, and the air smelled of wood smoke and sage, and something sweet that Lenora would later identify as the wild roses that grew along the creek bank. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and the words escaped before she could stop them. "It's home," Silas said from horseback. It was the first thing he had said directly to her, and he said it quietly with a fierce possessiveness that told Lenore everything she needed to know about what this land meant to him. This was not just property. This was the thing he had built when everything else was taken. This was his answer to a world that had tried to destroy him. They arrived at the house. Merritt helped Lenora down from the wagon, his hands large and careful around her waist, and she was acutely aware of how small she was next to these men. The top of her head barely cleared Merritt's shoulder. Boone dismounted and stalked toward the barn, without a word vanishing into the shadows with his horse. Silas carried her trunk inside with one hand as though it weighed nothing at all, and set it in the guest room with a precision that suggested he had thought about exactly where it should go. The house was larger than Lenore expected, clean and well-maintained, smelling of bread and roasting meat, and the particular warmth of a home where someone cared enough to keep the lamps trimmed and the floors swept. The kitchen was the heart of it, a big room with a cast-iron stove the size of a small altar, a table of hand-planed oak that could seat 8, and shelves lined with jars of preserves and dried herbs. The furniture throughout was handmade, rough but solid, built by men who valued function over beauty, but who had, perhaps without intending to, created something beautiful in the honesty of their craftsmanship. There were books on a shelf in the main room. More books than Lenora would have expected, and the sight of them made something in her chest loosen slightly, as though she had found a familiar face in a crowd of strangers. Agnes showed Lenora to the guest room. Small but clean, with a patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, a wash basin with fresh water, and a window that looked out toward the mountains where the last light was turning the snow peaks the color of fire. "Lock works from the inside," Agnes said, and she met Lenora's eyes with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. "You can secure it any time you want. Nobody enters this room without your permission. Nobody." Lenora nodded, and something about the way Agnes said it, not as a reassurance but as a statement of absolute fact, made her believe it. Supper was served at the big oak table, and it was the best meal Lenora had eaten in longer than she could remember. Venison stew thick with potatoes and carrots and wild onions. Bread that had come from the oven less than an hour ago, the crust golden and the inside soft and warm. Berry cobbler made from preserves Agnes had put up the previous autumn. Lenora tried to eat with the restraint appropriate to a lady at a strange table, and failed completely. She was too hungry, and Agnes kept adding food to her plate with a determination that brooked no argument. The dinner conversation revealed the brothers the way firelight reveals a room, illuminating some things while casting others into deeper shadow. Merritt carried most of the talking, asking Lenora about Ohio, about her education, about her experience with frontier life, which was essentially none. When she admitted she had never milked a cow, or saddled a horse, or split a piece of firewood in her life, Merritt laughed, not unkindly, with genuine amusement and something that might have been delight. "Well," he said, "you will learn all three before the week is out, or Agnes will have strong words for everyone at this table." Silas ate methodically, watching Lenora across the table with those unreadable whiskey eyes. He spoke only when asked a direct question, and answered in sentences so short that they were practically telegrams. When Merritt suggested he tell Lenora about the ranch operation, Silas said, 60 head of cattle, 8 horses, alfalfa fields, vegetable garden, it is work. That was all. But Lenore noticed that his expression softened when he looked at the house around him, at the table, at the food Agnes had prepared. There was love here, buried deep beneath the stone. Boone arrived late to the table, having spent an extra hour in the barn with the horses. He ate quickly, said almost nothing, and kept his eyes on his plate, as though eye contact were a concession he was not willing to make. But when Lenora accidentally knocked her fork off the table, it was Boone who moved. So fast she barely saw his hand. He caught the fork before it hit the floor and set it back beside her plate with a gruff "here" and fingers that were rough and scarred and surprisingly careful. He did not meet her eyes, but the instinct that drove the gesture told Lenora something important. Boone Kincaid's hostility was a wall, and behind it, whether he knew it or not, lived a man whose first impulse was to help. After supper, Agnes herded them out of the kitchen so she could clean, and Lenora stepped onto the porch because she needed air and space and a moment to process the fact that her life had veered so far from any plan she had ever made that the word plan no longer seemed to apply. The mountain night was cooler than she expected, sharp with altitude, and the sky above was something she had never seen. In Columbus, stars were scattered things dimmed by gas lamps and chimney smoke. Here the sky was a cathedral of light, thousands upon thousands of stars blazing in a darkness so deep it seemed to have weight and texture pressing down on the valley like a blessing. Merritt joined her after a few minutes. He leaned against this porch railing with easy grace, and without a word, he draped a wool blanket around her shoulders because he had noticed her shiver and acted on it without needing to be asked. They stood together in silence for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that exists between two people who have decided, however tentatively, to give each other the benefit of time. "I know this is not what you signed on for," Merritt said eventually. "Three of us instead of one. And I want you to know you can leave any time. We will pay your passage wherever you want to go, no conditions." "And if I stay," Lenore asked, "what exactly would I be staying for?" Merritt was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "Agnes placed that advertisement because she believes we need someone here, not for the reasons you might imagine. She is not trying to marry you off to any of us, not without your say-so. She just thinks we are—" He paused, searching. "Incomplete. Three men on a mountain working ourselves into the ground, not really living. She thinks you might change that." "And what do you think?" "I think Agnes is usually right about people, even when she goes about things the wrong way." "And your brothers," Merritt's smile turned rueful. "Silas thinks Agnes overstepped. Boone thinks the whole thing is foolishness. But neither of them told her to uninvite you, and neither of them will make you feel unwelcome." He paused. "Give Boone a few days. He is like a horse that has been handled rough. Takes time to trust." Lenore looked out at the stars and thought about trust and time and the fact that both were luxuries she could not afford. She thought about Victor Hale somewhere east of these mountains and whether the distance was enough. She thought about the $12 in her reticule and the letter from an advertisement that had promised one thing and delivered another. "One day," she said. "You all keep offering me one day." "It is a start," Merritt said. "Most good things are." The morning came early, the way mornings come on a working ranch, with boots on floorboards and the smell of coffee so strong it could practically pull a person out of bed by the collar. Lenore dressed in a simpler dress, dark green, calico practical, and pinned her hair. When she entered the kitchen, she found Agnes already at work rolling biscuit dough and Silas sitting at the table in the gray pre-dawn light. He did not notice her at first. He sat with a mug of coffee between his hands, and Lenora saw him unguarded for the first time. The hollowness in his eyes, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he stared at a point somewhere beyond the far wall, as though he were watching something only he could see, something terrible and far away that played behind his eyes on a loop he could not stop. Agnes glanced up and gave Lenora an almost imperceptible shake of her head. A warning. Do not mention it. Do not draw attention. Lenora understood. She had seen this look before on the faces of men who returned from the war to her father's business in Columbus. Men who were physically present but mentally elsewhere, trapped in a place where the sound of gunfire never fully stopped. She entered the kitchen, quietly said good morning in a voice that was soft but not pitying, and asked Agnes what she could help with. Silas blinked. The distance left his eyes. He looked at Lenora as though remembering she existed, and something crossed his expression too quickly to name. Then he drained his coffee, set the mug in the basin, put on his hat, and walked outside without a word. The brothers were gone before the sun cleared the peaks. Silas to check fence lines in the north pasture. Merritt to ride to the high meadow where the cattle grazed. Boone to work with a green horse in the corral, a half-wild animal that needed breaking before it could be trusted under saddle. Lenora watched them go from the kitchen window and marveled at how they moved across the land, each one enormous and purposeful covering ground, with the efficiency of men who had spent years learning the rhythms of this mountain. Agnes used the morning to show Lenora the workings of the ranch, the kitchen garden laid out in careful rows of potatoes, beans, cabbage, and tomatoes, each row mulched with straw against the mountain cold that could come even in late spring. The root cellar beneath the house, cool and dry, lined with shelves of preserves and root vegetables that would sustain them through the months when snow made the road to town impassable. The chicken coop where Lenora learned that gathering eggs was a negotiation between human stubbornness and chicken spite, and the chickens usually won. The well and the wash house. The smokehouse where strips of venison and elk hung in fragrant darkness. The barn cavernous and warm-smelling of hay and horse and oiled leather. As they worked, Agnes began to talk about the brothers, and the story she told settled over Lenora like a second landscape, one made not of mountains and valleys, but of loss and endurance, and the particular kind of strength that comes from having no choice but to survive. They came to Colorado in 1866, Agnes said, her hands busy with laundry as she spoke. 1 year after the war ended, Silas was 36, Merritt was 31, Boone was 26. Their father was killed at Gettysburg in the summer of 1863. Their mother fell ill that same winter. The fever came and went for more than a year each time, leaving her weaker than before. Boone stayed home to care for her while Silas and Merritt were still in the field. She finally died in early 1865, and Boone buried her alone. Agnes paused, wringing a shirt with more force than necessary. Silas served 4 years in the cavalry, 4 years of riding and fighting and watching men he loved get cut down beside him. He came home with that scar on his jaw and a dozen more you cannot see. He used his mustering out pay and a government land grant to claim this valley, and the three of them built everything you see from nothing. Cut the timber, raised the walls, broke the land. The first 2 winters nearly killed them. And Merritt, Lenore asked. Merritt enlisted in 1863 after their father died. He was 28, served 2 years, saw some of the worst of it near the end. That warmth you feel from him, that easy way he has with people, some of it is real and some of it is armor. He keeps everyone comfortable so they do not look too closely at what is underneath. And Boone, Agnes's expression shifted into something more complicated, something that was part tenderness and part worry, and part the particular helplessness of a woman who can see a wound but cannot reach it. Boone enlisted in early 1865. He was 24. He did not avoid the war, understand that. He stayed home to care for his mother because Silas and Merritt had already gone and someone had to be there. When his mother died in the winter of 1865, Boone joined up immediately. But the war ended just months later. He barely saw a real engagement. Agnes stopped working and looked at Lenora directly. The problem is not that Boone did not serve. The problem is that he believes he did not serve enough. His father died at Gettysburg before Boone could get there. His mother died while he was caring for her as though his presence made no difference. Silas fought 4 years. Merritt fought 2. And Boone arrived at the war just in time for it to end. He feels he was too late, Lenora said quietly. For everything, always too late. Too late to save his father, too late to save his mother, too late for the war, and so he spends his life trying to be faster, to be first, to prove he is enough. He breaks horses nobody else will touch. He rides into storms. He picks fights he does not need because the fighting makes him feel like he is finally doing something instead of standing by while the people he loves are destroyed. Agnes picked up the laundry basket. That boy has a heart the size of this valley, Lenora, but it is buried under so much guilt and anger that sometimes I wonder if even he remembers it is there. The days settled into a rhythm. Lenora woke before dawn. She helped Agnes with breakfast. She learned to make biscuits that were not quite as good as Agnes's, but were no longer actively dangerous. She gathered eggs. She weeded the garden. She hung laundry in the mountain wind and lost the battle with the bedsheets more often than she won. And slowly, carefully, like a creek finding its way around the stones, she began to know each of the Kincaid brothers. With Merritt, the knowing came through conversation and shared tasks. He took her to Ridgercross for supplies one morning, and during the long wagon ride they talked, really talked. He told her about Ohio, about growing up in a house where their father was a school teacher and their mother sang hymns so beautiful they could make grown men weep. He told her about the war briefly, just enough to reveal the shadow it had left. If you are smiling, Merritt said, people do not ask about the things behind the smile. Lenora recognized the strategy. She used it herself. In town, she met the people who would become the fabric of her new life. Mrs. Caldwell at the general store, a warm woman with a talent for extracting information through friendly conversation. Mr. Whitfield at the telegraph office, rail-thin and ink-stained. Sheriff Braddock, a competent man with sharp eyes. Lenora sent 2 telegrams that day. The first was to a former employer in Columbus, carefully worded asking whether anyone had been inquiring about her whereabouts. The second was to her Aunt Margaret in Glenwood, Colorado, the one remaining family connection. She had a lifeline she had kept secret, her plan, if the ranch did not work. With Boone, the knowing came through silence and animals in the particular language of physical work. At Agnes's firm insistence, Boone began teaching Lenora to ride. The lessons were tense at first. Boone was impatient. Lenora was nervous. The mare, a gentle creature named Pepper, seemed to sense both their anxieties and responded by being difficult for no reason other than solidarity with the general mood. But something shifted during those hours in the corral. Boone discovered that teaching required patience, which required him to slow down and pay attention to someone besides himself. Lenora discovered that Boone, for all his sharp edges, was extraordinarily gentle with animals, and that this gentleness leaked through when he forgot to guard it. One afternoon, Pepper spooked at a snake on the trail. The mare bolted toward the creek with Lenora clinging to the saddle, and Boone's reaction was immediate. He spurred his horse, cut off Pepper's penishing, and brought both animals to a stop in a spray of gravel and creek water. Lenora was shaking her face bloodless. Boone reached across the gap between their horses and caught her arm. "You are all right," he said, and his voice, usually sharp enough to cut rope, was astonishingly gentle. "Look at me. Breathe. You are all right." Lenora met his eyes and saw something she did not expect. Fear. Not for himself, for her. Boone Kincaid, who rode recklessly and picked fights and acted as though he feared nothing in this world, was terrified that she might have been hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. He pulled his hand back as though her skin had burned him. "Just watch the trail next time," he muttered and rode ahead. But Lenora had seen behind the wall, and she would not forget what she found there. With Silas, the knowing came in darkness. It was nearly midnight, more than a week after her arrival, and Lenora could not sleep. The fear that lived in her stomach, the constant awareness that Victor Hale was somewhere out there looking for her, had tightened into a knot that no amount of exhaustion could undo. She went to the kitchen for water and found Silas sitting at the table. No lamp, no fire, just a man and a cold cup of coffee, and a silence that felt like it had been going on for years. He did not startle when she appeared. He merely looked up as though he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come and prove that the world outside his memories still existed. "Bad night?" she asked. "They are all bad nights. Some are worse." Lenora poured herself water and sat down across from him, leaving space between them, the way you leave space around a fire that might flare. "My father used to have bad nights," she said carefully, "before things got truly terrible. He would sit in his study in the dark, and I could hear him talking to himself, working through problems, making plans that would not save him. Sometimes I brought him tea. We would sit together without speaking, and I think it helped. Not the tea, just having someone there." Silas was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere outside, an owl called from the barn roof. "You do not have to sit here with me," he said. "I am not good company when I am like this." "I am not looking for good company," Lenora replied. "I am looking for honest company, and you are the most honest man I have ever met, Silas Kincaid, even when you are trying not to be." Something moved behind his eyes, a crack in the stone. Not a smile, not yet, but the place where a smile might one day grow if given enough light and time. He told her about the war, not the battles, but the silence that came after. The way quiet felt worse than gunfire, because in the quiet you could hear yourself think, and thinking was the enemy. The way he came home to a mother's grave in a country that did not know what to do with the men it had broken, and so pretended they were whole. The way he built this ranch as an act of defiance, because if the world was going to take everything from him, he would build something it could not reach. Lenora told him about her father, not the debts and the disgrace. The man before that, the father who read to her every night until she was 12, who taught her to love books, who told her she could be anything, and how that man disappeared into whiskey and desperation, and how she grieved him long before he died. "We are both building new lives from the wreckage of old ones," Lenora said softly. "Is that not what this is?" "Maybe," Silas said. And then so quietly she almost missed it, spoken more to himself than to her, Easier to build when you are not building alone. Lenora placed her hand on the table between them, palm up open. An invitation, not a demand. Silas looked at it for a long moment, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The war between the part of him that had survived by trusting no one and the part that was so desperately tired of being alone. His calloused fingers settled over hers, warm and rough and trembling, slightly. They sat that way until the sky began to lighten, hand in hand, saying nothing, needing nothing. It was not romance, not yet. It was something more fundamental than that. It was two wounded people recognizing each other across a kitchen table in the dark and making a choice, however small, however tentative, not to be alone anymore. Agnes, who had woken at 3 and padded silently to the hallway and seen everything, pressed her hand to her mouth and retreated to her room before either of them knew she was there. Then the shadow fell. It came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks and 2 days after Lenora's arrival. Two pieces of news arrived at the ranch within hours of each other, and together they changed everything. The first was a telegram. Mr. Whitfield sent it out with Tommy Caldwell, the general store owner's teenage son, who rode the 12 miles from Ridgercross on a lathered horse. The telegram was from Lenora's former employer in Columbus, Miss Winslow Stop. Man named Hale inquired about you 3 weeks ago. Stop. Offered substantial reward for information. Stop. Did not provide your location. Stop. He is persistent. Stop. Be cautious. Stop. Lenora read it twice. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. The second piece of news came from Merritt, who returned from Ridgercross that same afternoon with his easy smile replaced by something hard and focused. He pulled Silas aside in the barn, but Lenora heard them through the open door. Two strangers showed up in town this morning. Well-dressed man, middle-aged, sharp eyes. Younger man with him, harder looking, wearing a gun belt. They told Mrs. Caldwell they were land speculators, but they were asking questions. Specific questions. Whether any young women had arrived in the area recently. A woman in her early 20s, fair-haired, traveling alone from Denver. A pause. Then Silas's voice, flat and dangerous. They described her. To the letter. The same afternoon brought a third blow, smaller, but no less devastating. The reply to Lenora's telegram to Aunt Margaret in Glenwood arrived through Tommy Caldwell on his second ride of the day. Dear Nora, stop. Thank God you are safe. Stop. Cannot send funds. Stop. Husband lost position. Stop. We are moving to family in Nebraska. Stop. So sorry. Stop. Right when settled. Stop. Aunt Margaret. Lenora sat at the kitchen table with both telegrams before her and felt every door she had been holding open in her mind slam shut one after another, like a hallway of exits becoming a hallway of walls. Victor Hale was hunting her. Strangers were asking about her in Ridgercross, and the one remaining person in the world who might have helped her had nothing to give. Agnes found her there and sat beside her without speaking. She read both telegrams, her expression hardening with each line, and then she covered Lenora's trembling hands with her own. Whatever you are carrying, Agnes said, you are not carrying it alone, not anymore, not if you do not want to. And so Lenora told her. Everything. Victor Hale, the debts, the forced marriage arrangement, the threats. The midnight flight from Denver with nothing but a trunk and a prayer and a newspaper advertisement that promised a life she had never dared imagine. That evening, Agnes gathered all three brothers in the main room and told them Lenora's story while Lenora sat nearby, unable to look at their faces, bracing for the anger or the rejection, for the inevitable moment when they would realize she had brought danger to their door and decide she had to go. Instead, the room went still. Silas's jaw tightened until the muscle beneath his scar jumped like a trapped thing. His hands curled into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was so controlled, it was almost more frightening than shouting would have been. This man forced himself on a woman who did not consent. That is not a business arrangement. That is something else entirely. He paused, and when he continued, each word fell like a stone dropped into deep water. And it will not happen while she is under this roof. Merritt turned to Lenora directly. The warmth was still there in his eyes, but it had been forged into something harder, something with an edge. Lenora, look at me, please. She did reluctantly. You do not have to be afraid of this man anymore. This ranch is 12 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by mountains and defended by 3 men who know every trail and every ridge for 50 miles in any direction. If Victor Hale comes looking for you, He will find something he is not prepared for. Boone's reaction was the one that undid her. The youngest Kincaid stood up from his chair with such force it scraped across the floor and banged against the wall. His face was flushed, his green hazel eyes blazing with a fury so raw it seemed to heat the air around him. "Where is he?" Boone demanded. "This Hale! Where is he right now?" No one answered. Boone strode toward the door, his whole body a weapon looking for a target. "I will ride to Denver tonight. I will find him, and I will make certain he never comes near her or anyone else ever again." "Boone," Silas's voice cut through the room like a blade, not loud but absolute. The voice of a man who had commanded men in battle and expected obedience as a condition of survival. "Sit down. We do this smart, not reckless." Boone stood by the door, vibrating with barely contained fury, his breath coming hard. For a moment, Lenora thought he would not listen. Then slowly he returned to his chair. But his eyes never left Lenora's face, and what she saw in them had changed completely. The wariness was gone. The suspicion was gone. In their place burned something fierce and almost desperate in its intensity. Boone Kincaid had decided in that moment that Lenora Winslow was worth protecting, and he would burn down everything, including himself, before he let anyone hurt her. Silas laid out a plan with military precision. Lenora would not go into Ridgercross until they knew who the strangers were. Merritt would make discreet inquiries through his contacts in town. Boone would ride the perimeter daily, watching every approach to the ranch. Silas would speak with Sheriff Braddock directly. "And if it is Hale," Lenora asked, and her voice was barely a whisper, "if he has sent men to find me." Silas looked at her across the room. In the lamplight, his whiskey eyes held something she had not seen before, something beyond protectiveness, beyond duty, something personal. "Then they found the wrong valley to go searching in," he said. That night, Lenora lay in the guest room with the telegrams under her pillow, listening to the sound of Boone's horse circling the ranch in the darkness. The hoofbeats came every few minutes, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat surrounding the house. She thought about the three men who had positioned themselves between her and the world. About Agnes, who had brought her here for reasons that went deeper than a newspaper advertisement. About the ranch that had started to feel like something she had never truly had before. She thought about Victor Hale somewhere east of these mountains, with his money and his men, and his absolute refusal to accept that she was not his to claim. And she thought about the fact that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not want to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted to fight. She wanted to stand her ground on this mountain with these people and build something that no one, not Victor Hale, not the past, not the fear that had followed her across 1,000 miles, could take away. She did not know yet whether that was courage or foolishness. Perhaps she thought as sleep finally found her, the hoofbeats outside fading into the rhythm of her own breathing, it was both. And perhaps that was enough. 3 weeks changed Lenora Winslow in ways she could not have predicted. Her hands told the story. The soft palms that had turned pages in Columbus drawing rooms were now rough with calluses from the garden hoe and the laundry wringer and the wooden handle of the axe that Silas had placed in her grip one morning, without ceremony, positioning her fingers around the shaft and showing her how to read the grain of the wood before the blade fell. His hands had covered hers for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to correct her technique, long enough for Lenora to feel the controlled power in his grip and wonder what it would be like to be held by those hands for a different reason entirely. She pushed the thought away. It came back. She pushed it away again. The days had taken on a rhythm that felt both foreign and increasingly like home. She rose before dawn and helped Agnes with breakfast, and her biscuits had graduated from inedible to acceptable, which Agnes praised with the restrained enthusiasm of a woman who had once eaten hardtack for 3 winters straight and could therefore appreciate progress in any form. She gathered eggs, she weeded the garden, she learned to identify the herbs that grew wild along the creek bank, rosemary and sage and yarrow, and which ones Agnes used for cooking, and which for medicine, and which for nothing except the pleasure of their smell. She learned to milk Bess, the brown dairy cow, who had regarded Lenora's first attempts with the frank contempt of an animal who had been milked by competent hands for 8 years and could recognize an amateur. By the 5th morning, Lenora's fingers had found the rhythm, and when the milk streamed steadily into the pail, she felt a surge of pride so fierce and disproportionate to the accomplishment that it almost made her laugh. She had never in her life produced anything with her own hands. Not bread, not fire, not the simplest necessities of survival. Everything had always been done for her, provided for her, decided for her. Not anymore. Merritt took her to Ridgercross every week for supplies, and those wagon rides became the architecture of their friendship. He talked and she listened, and then she talked and he listened, and somewhere in the exchange they found common ground that neither had expected. They were both from Ohio. They both loved music, though neither could play an instrument without causing suffering to everyone within earshot. They both used laughter as a wall, though Merritt's wall was taller and more practiced than hers. One afternoon, returning from town, Merritt said something that lodged in Lenora's memory and stayed. Silas has not slept through a full night in 7 years. He set his eyes on the road, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. Not once. He walks the halls. He checks the locks. Sometimes he stands on the porch at 3 in the morning, staring at the dark like he is waiting for an enemy that never comes but never goes away either. A pause. Since you arrived, he has been sleeping until 4. That is an extra hour. That may not sound like much to you, but to me, it is a miracle. Lenora did not respond. She did not trust herself to speak without her voice breaking. Boone's riding lessons continued, and the transformation in the youngest Kincaid was the one that surprised Lenora most. Teaching her required patience, a quality Boone possessed in abundance with horses, but had never thought to extend to humans. He discovered that the same principles applied. Slow movements, low voice, no sudden demands. The willingness to repeat the same lesson 10 times without frustration because trust could not be rushed, and any attempt to force it only drove it further away. On the morning Lenora successfully cantered Pepper around the full perimeter of the corral, without losing her seat or her nerve, Boone leaned against the fence and said, "Not bad." And the ghost of a smile that crossed his face there and gone in a heartbeat was the first genuine smile Lenora had seen from him. It transformed his features completely, made him look young, made him look like the man he might have been if war and guilt and loss had not gotten to him first. One evening, a mountain storm struck without warning, wind howling down the valley and rain hammering the roof like fists. Silas and Merritt were in the barns securing the animals. Agnes had retired early. Lenora was alone at the kitchen when a crack of lightning struck so close, the lamps flickered and the windows shook in their frames, and she found herself pressed against the wall with her hands over her ears, breathing too fast, the sound too much like doors slamming too much, like the heavy footsteps of men who came to collect what her father owed. Boone appeared in the kitchen doorway, soaked from checking on the horses in the north corral, water dripping from his hat brim. He saw her against the wall and stopped. He did not ask if she was all right. He could see that she was not. Instead, he crossed to the stove, checked the fire, added a log. He filled the kettle and set it to heat. He pulled a chair close to the warmth and nodded toward it. Lenora sat. Boone sat across from her. Neither spoke. The storm raged outside, but the kitchen was warm, and there was something unexpectedly comforting about his silent, solid presence. This young man who did not know how to say the right thing, and so chose instead to simply be there, which was the right thing after all. When the kettle boiled, Boone stood and made 2 cups of tea with the clumsy concentration of a man performing surgery on the unfamiliar terrain. He set one in front of Lenora. Their eyes met over the steam. "Thank you, Boone. Do not mention it." A pause. "Truly, do not. Merritt finds out I made tea, and I will never hear the end of it." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, and despite everything, despite the storm and the fear and the weight of all that she was carrying, Lenora felt herself smile back. But the fear never fully left. Every day that passed without incident made the tension worse, not better, because Lenora knew Victor Hale, and she knew that silence from a man like him was never retreat. It was preparation. The 2 strangers Merritt had reported in Ridgercross had not been seen again, but their absence proved nothing. Hale was patient. Hale was methodical. Hale had the resources of a man who had spent 20 years building a fortune on the backs of other people's misery, and he would not stop looking for her simply because she had found mountains to hide behind. Silas adjusted the brothers' routines without discussion or fanfare. One of them was always within earshot of the ranch house. Boone rode the ridgelines at dawn and dusk, scanning for riders approaching from unexpected directions. Merritt kept his ear to the ground in Ridgercross, listening for strangers and rumors. Silas checked the perimeter of the property every morning, reading the ground for tracks the way he had once read battlefields for the movement of enemy cavalry. They did not tell Lenora what they were doing. They did not need to. She saw it in the way they moved in the rifles that were never far from reach, in the way Silas's eyes went to the windows every time a horse whinnied in the corral. They had built a fortress around her, invisible and absolute, and the realization that three men she had known for less than a month were willing to organize their entire lives around her safety made something in Lenora's chest ache in a way she had no name for. One midnight, unable to sleep, she found Silas at the kitchen table again. This time, she did not ask if it was a bad night. She simply sat down across from him, poured 2 cups of cold coffee, and waited. He told her about Gettysburg. Not the battle itself, but the letter that came after. The letter that told him his father was dead, that he had been buried in a field so thick with bodies that the burial detail had to work in shifts for 3 days. Silas had received the letter while sitting on a log in a Virginia forest eating hardtack and waiting for orders, and he had read it twice and folded it and put it in his pocket and gone on fighting for 2 more years because there was nothing else to do. Lenora told him about Victor Hale, not the debts or the threats, which he already knew, but the night Hale had come to her boarding house in Denver and stood outside her door for 20 minutes without knocking. She had pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, listening to his footsteps pace back and forth on the other side of a door that had no bolt. He left eventually. She did not sleep for 3 days. "We are both haunted," Lenora said. "Yours by war, mine by a man who believes he owns me." "Nobody owns you, Lenora. Not him, not anyone. I know that now." Silas reached across the table and took her hand, deliberately this time. Not the tentative touch of their first midnight meeting, but a firm, certain grip that said he had made a decision and would not be moved from it. "As long as you are on this mountain," he said, "you are safe. I give you my word." And Lenora, who had learned the hard way that promises were often just the preamble to betrayal, looked into Silas Kincaid's eyes and believed him. The violence came on a Thursday. It began with a bank robbery in Ridgercross. Outlaws hit during a night storm, cracking the safe, roughing up the banker Mr. Peterson, and escaping with the payroll and most of the town's cash reserves. Sheriff Braddock organized a posse at first light and sent riders to the surrounding ranches asking for volunteers and warning of danger. Tommy Caldwell brought the news to the Kincaid ranch on a lathered horse, breathless and wide-eyed. The brothers listened with faces that grew harder with every word. Silas made the decision. The outlaws were a threat to the entire valley. The Kincaid brothers would ride with the posse. Lenora felt the bottom drop out of her world. She caught Silas on the porch as he was checking his rifle, and she did not care that her voice cracked or that her composure, so carefully maintained for weeks, was as coming apart at the seams. "Please do not go. I know it is selfish. I know you have a duty to your neighbors. But if something happens to you, to any of you, that cannot—" Silas turned to her, and for one unguarded moment the stone fell away completely. She saw the man behind it, vulnerable, uncertain, wanting desperately to stay, but knowing he could not. "This is what neighbors do," he said quietly. "If we do not stand for each other when trouble comes, there is no point in any of it. Then be careful, all three of you. Promise me." He reached up and touched her face. It was the first time he had deliberately touched her anywhere other than her hand, and the roughness of his calloused thumb against her cheek, catching a tear she had not felt fall, sent something electric through her entire body. "I promise," he said. Then he turned and walked to his horse before the emotion could break what remained of his resolve. Merritt hugged her, brief and fierce, his arms around her for exactly 2 seconds, his voice in her ear. "Lock the doors. We will be back." Boone said nothing, but as he mounted his horse, he caught Lenora's eye and gave her a single firm nod, a warrior's promise. Then all three brothers kicked their horses into a gallop and were gone. Agnes and Lenora were alone. The riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch in the middle of the afternoon. 7 or 8 men on tired horses, all of them armed, all of them moving with the careless menace of men who had nothing to lose and knew it. Agnes spotted them first from the kitchen window. Her face went hard in an instant, 56 years of frontier survival compressing into a single expression of calculated readiness. She moved with a speed that belied her age, pulling the shotgun from above the door, cracking it open to check the load, snapping it shut. "Get inside," Agnes said. "Stay away from the windows." Lenora grabbed the cast-iron skillet from its hook by the stove. It was heavy enough to fracture a skull if swung with conviction, and Lenora discovered in that moment that she possessed a great deal of conviction. The lead rider dismounted in the yard, a heavy man with a gray beard and cold eyes wearing a long coat despite the warm afternoon. He walked toward the porch the way a man walks when he believes the world belongs to him. The pounding on the door shook the frame. "Hello in the house. We are lost travelers looking for directions and a meal. Open up and we will be on our way." Agnes did not answer, more pounding harder. "We know someone is home. Saw your chimney smoke a mile out. We just need water and food. Will not be any trouble." A younger voice from outside, colder and sharper. "She is lying about nobody being home. I can smell cooking. And look at the corral. Only 2 horses, neither ridden today. No men here." Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs. She positioned herself behind the door frame, with the skillet raised, every muscle coiled. Agnes stepped close to the door and spoke with a voice that did not waver by so much as a fraction. "First man through this door gets a chest full of buckshot. Second man gets the same. You want to test that over a bowl of stew, be my guest." Silence from the other side. Lenora could hear them conferring in low voices. She could feel the violence gathering on the other side of that thin wooden door, like thunderheads building on a ridge, all pressure and no release, and she thought, this is how it ends. In a stranger's kitchen on a mountain she did not know existed 2 months ago, holding a skillet like a weapon, because it is the only thing between her and men who would do her harm. Then hoofbeats, many hoofbeats coming fast from the east. Through the gap in the curtains, Lenora saw the men in the yard spin around. Hands went to weapons. Someone cursed. Riders, a dozen at least, move. They scattered like quail flushed from cover, mounting up and spurring their exhausted horses toward the western hills. Within 30 seconds, the yard was empty, except for hoof prints in the dust. The posse thundered in, and there was Silas in the lead, rifle in hand, his face white with a fury that Lenora would remember for the rest of her life. Sheriff Braddock behind him, Merritt and Boone flanking. Silas was off his horse before the animal stopped. He took the porch steps in 2 strides and came through the door like a force of nature, his eyes sweeping the room until they found Agnes with the shotgun and Lenora with the skillet. Both alive, both unharmed. Something in his face broke open. Relief so raw and so deep that it was almost indistinguishable from pain. "You are all right," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "We are fine," Agnes said firmly, "but those men meant to break in. Leader had a gray beard, rode a bay horse with a white blaze." "Redmond," Sheriff Braddock said from the doorway. "Cyrus Redmond. We have been tracking him since dawn." Silas turned to Lenora. She was still holding the skillet, her knuckles white, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. He crossed the room and took the skillet from her hand, gently set it on the counter, and then stood there for a moment, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, close enough that she could have leaned forward and pressed her face into his chest. She wanted to. She wanted to more than she had ever wanted anything. But there were men watching, and a sheriff in the doorway, and outlaws in the hills. So she simply looked up at him and said, "You came back." "I will always come back," Silas said. And the way he said it was not a promise, it was a fact. The posse split. Merritt and Boone rode with Sheriff Braddock to pursue the fleeing outlaws. Silas stayed at the ranch because Boone, in a moment of maturity that stunned everyone present, had said, "Silas stays. The ranch needs its best defender, and that is you, brother." Silas had looked at Boone and seen something new in the youngest Kincaid's face. Not the reckless boy, a man emerging. They cornered 4 of Redmond's gang in a box canyon 8 miles west. The outlaws refused to surrender. Gunfire erupted. Boone took a bullet. He had charged the front entrance of the abandoned homestead, where the outlaws had fortified drawing fire so the sheriff's men could flank from the rear. It worked. The outlaws were captured or killed, but a rifle ball tore through Boone's upper arm, cracking bone and shredding muscle. Merritt brought him home draped across his saddle, barely conscious, shirt soaked, crimson jaw, locked against pain he refused to show. Agnes cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of her arm. Silas moved to help, his hands steady from years of battlefield triage. But it was Lenora who took command. The training she had received helping the doctor in Columbus skills she had almost forgotten rose through her fear and her gentle upbringing like water through sand. She examined the wound with hands that were clinical and precise. Bullet had passed clean through, bone cracked, not shattered. She directed Agnes to boil water. She told Silas to hold Boone still. She cleaned the wound, extracted fragments of cloth driven into the flesh, and bound the arm with a competence that made Agnes stare and Silas go very quiet. Throughout the procedure, Boone watched her face. Sweat ran down his temples. His jaw was clenched so tight that the tendons stood out like cables, but he did not cry out, not once. When Lenora's hands trembled slightly while threading a bandage, Boone reached up with his uninjured hand and steadied her wrist. "I trust you," he said through his teeth. 2 words. The most important 2 words Boone Kincaid had ever spoken in his life. Afterward, Lenora walked out to the porch and sat on the top step and let herself shake. The trembling started in her hands and moved through her whole body in waves, the accumulated terror and focus and adrenaline releasing all at once. Silas sat beside her, closer than he had ever been. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. "You saved his arm," Silas said quietly. "Maybe his life. I was so frightened the entire time. That is what courage is, being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." They sat together until the stars came out and something between them shifted into a new alignment. Not just gratitude, not just attraction. Partnership. They were in this together now, all pretense of temporary arrangement stripped away by blood and fear and the fierce need to protect the people they had come to love. The truth that emerged in the days after the battle was worse than anyone expected. Sheriff Braddock's prisoners talked. Under interrogation, one of the younger outlaws admitted that their gang had been receiving information from someone in Denver. Specific information: train schedules, payroll shipments, the movements of territorial marshals. Someone with money and connections was directing the robberies from behind the scenes. Merritt, working his contacts in town, uncovered the rest. The 2 well-dressed strangers who had asked about Lenora weeks ago had been in the area longer than anyone realized, and they had been seen meeting with men matching the description of Redmond's gang. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. "Victor Hale," Lenora said, and the name tasted like ashes. "He is funding the outlaws. The train robberies, the bank, the attack on this ranch. All of it is connected. All of it leads back to him. He created chaos to keep the law busy while his men searched for you," Merritt said. "And Boone was shot because of me. Boone was shot because outlaws shot him." Silas's voice was iron. "The blame falls on the men who pulled the trigger and the man who paid them. Never on you." 2 days later, the worst happened. Sheriff Braddock sent an urgent rider. Victor Hale had arrived in Ridgercross, in person, accompanied by 4 armed men. He had told the entire town that Lenora was his fiancée, that she had fled Denver in a state of mental distress after her father's death, and that he was simply a concerned man trying to bring his beloved home safely. "Some people believe him," Braddock's message read. "He is smooth and well-dressed and very convincing." Lenora stood into the kitchen with the letter in her hand and said the words that changed everything. "I will go to town. I will face him." She stood on the main street of Ridgecross on a clear, sharp morning, wearing the navy blue traveling dress she had arrived in, the cameo brooch at her throat catching the light. Between the 3 towering Kincaid brothers, she looked small enough to break. But her back was straight and her chin was lifted. Victor Hale stepped out of the boarding house. Tall, well-dressed, gray suit, polished boots. A face that was handsome the way a blade is handsome, all edges and purpose. "Lenora," he called loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear, spreading his arms like a man welcoming home a lost child. "Thank God. I have been so worried. Your father's death, the strain it has clearly affected your mind. Come, let me take you home." Lenora's heart hammered. Her legs felt like water, but she had faced outlaws. She had stitched a bullet wound. She had survived every terrible thing this world had thrown at her, and she was done running. "I am not your fiancé, Mr. Hale." Her voice carried across the street, clear and steady. "I never agreed to marry you. You used my father's debts to coerce me into an arrangement I never consented to. When I refused, you threatened me. I fled Denver because you gave me no choice." She turned to the sheriff. "This man has hired agents to track me across Colorado. He has connections to the outlaw gang that robbed your bank and your trains." Hale's mask cracked. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman. Silas stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. This woman is under the protection of the Kincaid family. She is telling the truth. If you have a legal claim, make it through the courts. If you come near her again anywhere, you will answer to me and my brothers. Merritt and Boone flanked him. 3 men, all armed, all radiating an absolute willingness to finish this. Hale looked at them, looked at the crowd that had already chosen sides, looked at the sheriff with his hand on his pistol. We will see about this, Hale said and walked away. Lenora's knees buckled. Silas caught her, one arm around her waist holding her upright. You did it, he murmured close to her ear. You stood up to him. That evening, Silas asked to speak with her alone. They walked to the creek, to the spot that had become their place, where the water ran over smooth stones and the mountain stood guard. If you married me, Silas said, and there was a tension in his voice she had never heard, Hale would lose any claim. A married woman cannot be forced into a prior arrangement. The law is clear. A marriage of protection, Lenora said softly. If that is what you want it to be. He paused. But I would be lying if I said that is all I want. He turned to face her. In the fading light, his whiskey eyes were luminous with something she had never seen in them before. Vulnerability. The armor laid down. I spent 7 years convincing myself I did not need anyone. That solitude was safety. That caring about someone was just another way to be destroyed. Then you stepped off that stagecoach with your blue dress and your brave eyes and your absolute refusal to let fear win, and everything I believed about not needing anyone turned out to be a lie. His voice dropped lower, rougher, as though the words cost him something precious. Every morning when I hear your voice in the kitchen, the nightmares from the night before get a little quieter. When you sat with me in the dark and held my hand, it was the first time in 7 years I felt like a whole person, instead of just the broken pieces of one. He took her hands. His fingers were trembling. Marry me, Lenora. Not because you need protection. Because I need you. Because this ranch, this life, none of it means anything if you are not in it. Lenora looked at this man. Scarred, stoic, wounded, brave. A man who built things with his own hands and walked the halls at night because sleep was an enemy, and spoke in measured words because he was afraid of what might come out if he spoke freely. Ask me again, she said, properly this time. Properly. Not because of Hale, not because of the law. Ask me because you want me to say yes. Silas Kincaid, who had survived 4 years of war and 7 years of solitude, and the particular agony of learning to hope again, after hope had nearly destroyed him, took both her hands and said, Lenora Winslow, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a life here with me on this mountain for however long we both shall live? Yes, she whispered. Yes, Silas, I will. He kissed her forehead with such tenderness that something inside her broke open a lock she had not known she was carrying, a door she had not known she had closed. And standing there by the creek with the mountains turning gold in the last light, Lenora Winslow stopped running. Back at the house, Merritt embraced his brother with genuine joy and kissed Lenora's cheek. About time, he said, and his eyes were bright. Boone clasped Silas's hand with his uninjured arm and said with a roughness that barely disguised the emotion beneath, You had better be good to her, or I will break your other jaw. Agnes wept openly. First time any of them had seen it. She declared she was making a cake even though it was nearly midnight. And Lenora, surrounded by the people who had become her family, in ways she never expected and could not yet fully comprehend, felt something she had never felt before in her entire life. Home. She was home. The town of Ridgercross had not seen a wedding this anticipated since old Dutch Meyer married the widow Hoffman 6 years ago, and half the valley showed up uninvited because there was nothing else to do on a Saturday in February. But the Kincaid wedding was different. The Kincaid wedding meant something. Word of Lenora's confrontation with Victor Hale had traveled through the surrounding ranches and homesteads, the way fire travels through dry grass fast and impossible to contain. By the morning after she stood on that main street and told the truth to a man who had built his life on lies, every person within 30 miles of Ridgecross knew the story. The mail-order bride from Ohio, the 3 mountain brothers who took her in, the Denver businessman who tried to claim her like property, and the woman who looked him in the eye and said no. People chose sides the way people in small frontier communities always choose sides quickly and with the full weight of their convictions. And they chose Lenora. Mrs. Caldwell offered to host a reception at the general store. Sheriff Braddock's wife, Sarah, brought a length of white lace that had belonged to her own mother and pressed it into Lenora's hands with a firmness that did not permit refusal. Ranchers' wives Lenora had never met sent gifts by way of their husbands. A jar of blackberry preserves from the Henshaw place 10 miles north. A set of hand-embroidered handkerchiefs from old Mrs. Dunlop, who had not left her homestead in 2 years, but heard the story from her grandson and wanted to contribute. A small leather-bound Bible with a pressed columbine tucked inside the cover from someone who did not leave a name. Lenora sat at the kitchen table one evening, surrounded by these small tokens, and wept. Agnes found her and asked what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Lenora said through her tears. "That is the strange part. Nothing is wrong. These people do not know me. They have known me for weeks, not years, and they are welcoming me as though I have been here my whole life." Agnes sat beside her and covered Lenora's hand with her own weathered one. "That is what community means out here, where the nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away and a bad winter can kill you if you face it alone. People look after each other. It is not sentiment, it is survival." She squeezed gently. "And you, my girl, have already shown this town that you are one of us." The days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and the particular nervous energy that precedes any irrevocable decision. Agnes threw herself into the work with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting 5 years for one of these boys to come to his senses and was not about to let the moment pass without proper observance. She cleaned the house until the floorboards gleamed. She baked enough food for 30 guests, though they were expecting perhaps 15. And she altered a dress for Lenora in secret, working by lamplight after the household was asleep, her needle moving with the painstaking care of a woman stitching together something far more important than fabric. It was ivory cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple in the way that true elegance is always simple. When Lenora saw it on the morning of the wedding, she pressed her hands to her mouth and could not speak for a long time. "It was my daughter's," Agnes said. "She wore it to her own wedding, and she had 12 good years with her husband before the fever took him. I would like to think it carries some of that happiness with it." "Agnes, I cannot accept this." "You can and you will. What else am I going to do with it? Let the moths have it." Agnes's voice was brisk, but her eyes were bright. "Besides, my daughter always said beautiful things should be used, not hidden away. Now hold still while I fix your hair." Agnes arranged Lenora's honey blonde hair in an elegant twist, weaving small wildflowers into the strands. Blue columbine and white yarrow, the same flowers that grew along the creek where Silas had asked her to marry him. When Lenora looked in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because of the dress or the flowers, because the face in the glass was calm, certain, at peace in a way that Lenora Winslow of Columbus, Ohio, would not have believed possible. Meanwhile, the brothers were undergoing their own transformations. Merritt had ridden to the neighboring ranch the previous day and returned with a borrowed suit for Silas and a clean shirt for himself. The suit was slightly too tight across Silas's shoulders because no suit made for an ordinary man would ever fit properly on a Kincaid, but it was dark and well-pressed, and it made Silas look like a man who had stepped out of a daguerreotype. Someone had convinced him to shave, and without the stubble, the scar along his jaw was more visible, a thin white line that told the story of a war he had survived and a peace he was still learning to make. Boone, his arms still bound in a sling, fashioned from a strip of clean muslin that Lenora had changed that morning, had polished his boots until they shone and borrowed a clean shirt from Merritt that hung slightly loose on his leaner frame. He stood before the small mirror in the hallway and attempted to comb his auburn hair into submission, failed, attempted again, and then gave up with a muttered oath that Agnes pretended not to hear. The ceremony took place at the Ridgercross church on a Saturday afternoon, so beautiful it felt like the mountains themselves had dressed for the occasion. Clear blue sky from horizon to horizon. Wildflowers blooming on every hillside. The peaks standing sentinel in their eternal snow, witnesses to something small and human and infinitely important happening in the valley below. Lenora was surprised by the crowd. The small church was full. Ranchers who had ridden hours to attend. Townspeople who had closed their shops for the afternoon. Mrs. Caldwell in her best bonnet. Mr. Whitfield from the telegraph office, hat in hand, standing near the back as though afraid of taking up too much space. Sheriff Braddock and Sarah. Even the stagecoach driver who had brought Lenora to Ridgercross 2 months ago, a grizzled man named Harlan who had not attended a social event in 4 years, but who told Mrs. Caldwell he would not miss this one for anything. Lenora walked down the aisle on Agnes's arm. Agnes, who had set this entire story in motion, who had placed the advertisement, chosen Lenora from among the respondents, manipulated 3 stubborn mountain men into accepting a woman they did not think they needed, and then stood back and watched as the walls came down one by one. Agnes was crying openly and without a trace of embarrassment, and Lenora loved her for it. Silas waited at the front of the church with Reverend Marsh, and when he turned and saw Lenora coming toward him, the expression on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not surprise. It was not mere appreciation. It was the look of a man who had been wandering in darkness for years and had just seen the first light of dawn. Merritt and Boone stood beside their brother. Merritt was beaming, his natural warmth turned up to full force, his amber eyes bright with a joy that was entirely genuine and only slightly bittersweet. He had come to care for Lenora deeply, and the caring had taught him something he had not expected. That love did not have to be romantic to be real. That gaining a sister could fill a space he had not known was empty. Boone stood at rigid attention, his injured arm in its sling, his green hazel eyes fierce with an emotion he would have denied if anyone had named it. Pride. He was proud of his brother, proud of Lenora, proud to be standing here in this church as a witness to something that proved the world could still produce moments worth the suffering it took to reach them. Reverend Marsh spoke the familiar words. Lenora tried to focus on them, but her attention kept drifting to Silas, to the warmth of his hand around hers, solid and certain, to the way he stood, shoulders back, chin level, facing this moment, with the same quiet courage he brought to everything, to the slight tremor in his voice when he said the words that mattered. I do. When it was Lenora's turn, her voice came out stronger than she expected, clear enough to reach the back of the church, steady enough to carry the full weight of her conviction. I do. They were pronounced husband and wife. Silas kissed her gently, a kiss that was more promise than passion, more tenderness than heat, a beginning rather than a culmination. The congregation applauded. Agnes sobbed. Boone whistled sharply through his teeth. Merritt shouted, "About time, brother!" And the laughter that followed filled the church like sunlight. Outside, the celebrations spilled into the afternoon. The fiddler from the Henshaw Ranch played reels that got even the most reluctant dancers moving. Merritt danced with every woman present and several who had not intended to dance at all. Boone sat on the church steps surrounded by children from the town, telling them stories about mountain lions and grizzly bears with a dramatic flair that had them gasping and shrieking with delight, and Lenora watched him and thought about how much of his gentleness he kept hidden and how much of his fierceness was just love looking for an outlet. Sheriff Braddock found Lenora during the celebration. His face was warm, but carried something beneath the warmth. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, and the name sent a thrill through her that she suspected would never entirely fade. "Congratulations, and I want you to know my office is watching Mr. Hale closely. He has not moved in 3 days. A pause. "I also received word this morning from the territorial marshal. They are sending a federal investigator. Seems Hale's business dealings have attracted attention beyond our valley. The investigator arrives within the week." "That is wonderful news." "It is, but until he gets here, please be careful. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind." 3 days after the wedding, a morning like any other morning, except that everything was different. Lenora was in the kitchen making bread flour on her hands, the house quiet around her. Agnes had gone down to the root cellar. Silas and Merritt were in the high pasture checking cattle. Boone was in the barn tending a sick calf that had kept him up most of the night. The sound of a single horse reached her through the open window. Lenora looked out, and the blood in her veins turned to ice water. Victor Hale rode into the ranch yard alone. No bodyguards, no hired men. Just one man on a fine horse, wearing a gray suit that had no business being within 100 miles of a working ranch, and a smile that made Lenora's skin crawl the way it always had, the way it had the night he stood outside her door in Denver, the way it had when he told her she belonged to him. He dismounted, tied his horse to the corral fence, walked toward the porch with the unhurried confidence of a man who still believed the world was his. Lenora's hand stopped trembling. Something cold and clear moved through her, not courage exactly, but something beyond fear. A calm that came from having already survived the worst and knowing she could survive whatever came next. She took the shotgun from above the door. Agnes's shotgun. The same weapon that had held off 7 outlaws. She checked the loads. She opened the door. She stepped onto the porch and leveled both barrels at Victor Hale's chest. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. His smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. Surprise. He had expected the frightened girl who fled Denver. He had not expected this. That is not very welcoming, Lenora. My name is Lenora Kincaid. You are trespassing on my land. Leave. I came to make a reasonable offer. Return to Denver with me quietly and I will forget everything. The public humiliation, the accusations, all of it. There is nothing between us, Mr. Hale. There never was. I am married. I am home. You need to leave before my husband returns. The mask fell. What replaced it was the real Victor Hale, the one Lenora had always known, lived beneath the fine suits and the polished manners. Naked fury, possessive rage, the face of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered and could not comprehend that it was happening now. You think marriage to some mountain rancher protects you? I have lawyers who will have this annulled before the ink dries. I have judges who owe me favors. I have men who will... You have nothing here. The voice came from behind Hale and he spun. Boone Kincaid stood at the corner of the house, his injured arm in its sling, his other hand holding a rifle with the easy familiarity of a man who had been handling firearms since he was old enough to walk. His green hazel eyes burned with a cold, focused fury that was entirely different from the hot recklessness Lenora had seen in him before. This was controlled. This was deliberate. This was a man who had found the stillness at the center of himself. Nothing except a trespassing charge, came Merritt's voice from the opposite direction. He stood at the corral fence rifle resting casually across his arms, his expression stripped of every trace of warmth. What remained was something harder and more dangerous than Lenore had ever seen in the Middle Kincaid. Then Silas rode around the corner of the barn on his gray gelding. He had been alerted by the signal. Boone had arranged a system of hand mirrors, catching sunlight from the barn loft that the brothers had established after the outlaw siege. He swung down from the horse, and his physical presence filled the yard like a thunderclap. 6 feet 6 inches of barely controlled fury, shoulders, square jaw, set eyes burning. Mr. Hale? His voice was low, even, absolutely terrifying. You are standing on my land, threatening my wife. You have 60 seconds to mount your horse and ride out of this valley. And if I ever see your face again for any reason, I will forget that I am a God-fearing man. Hale looked at the 3 brothers, 3 enormous men all armed, positioned to cut off every escape. He looked at Lenora on the porch with the shotgun. He looked at Agnes, who had emerged from the root cellar carrying a butcher knife and wearing an expression that suggested she knew exactly where to put it. For the first time in his life, Victor Hale understood that money and connections and lawyers meant nothing on a mountain where the law was written in blood and loyalty and the willingness to die for the people you loved. This is not over, he hissed. Yes, it is, Lenora said, and her voice steady and unbreakable and ringing with the authority of a woman who had earned every syllable of her strength was the final word. Hale mounted his horse and rode north, not toward Ridgercross, toward the hills, toward Redmond's territory. Silas watched him go. He is not heading back to town. He is going to Redmond, Merritt said. He is desperate. Then we finish this, Silas replied. The posse rode out at dawn. Sheriff Braddock, Marshal Taggart, the federal investigator who had arrived 2 days early and brought 4 deputies with him, the 3 Kincaid brothers. 6 volunteers from town men who had watched Lenora stand up to Hale on that main street and decided that if she was brave enough to fight, they were brave enough to ride. Lenora and Agnes waited at the ranch, the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where every distant sound could be a gunshot and every minute stretches until it breaks. I hate this, Lenora said, standing at the window, her hands clenched at her sides. I hate being the one who waits. Waiting is its own kind of courage, Agnes replied from her rocking chair, her hands busy with mending because Agnes's hands were always busy. Any fool can charge into a fight. It takes real strength to sit still and trust. In the hills, the posse cornered Hale and what remained of Redmond's gang in a narrow canyon 12 miles north. Marshal Taggart called for surrender. Hale refused. Redmond, realizing that Hale had led federal officers directly to his door, turned on his employer with the fury of a man who had been used and discarded. The outlaws fractured. Some surrendered. Some fought. Some ran. Hale tried to escape through a narrow pass on the western rim of the canyon. He kicked his fine horse up the rocky trail, certain that money and desperation would carry him through the way they always had. Boone was waiting. He sat his horse on the narrow trail, the mountain falling away on one side, and the rock wall pressing close on the other. His injured arm was bound tight against his body. His rifle rested across the saddle. He did not draw it. Hale pulled up short. The two men faced each other across 20 feet of mountain trail, with nothing between them but thin air and the accumulated weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Get out of my way," Hale said, and reached for the pistol at his belt. "I would not do that," Boone said. And then Boone Kincaid, who had spent his entire life believing he was too late, who had tried to compensate with speed and recklessness and fury, did the bravest thing he had ever done. He sat still. He did not draw his weapon. He did not charge. He did not move. He simply sat his horse and held Victor Hale's gaze with those green hazel eyes that had been forged in guilt and loneliness, in a desperate need to prove himself, and he let the stillness speak. The silence lasted 10 seconds. It felt like 10 years. Boone was not too late. Not this time. He was exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. And the knowing of that, the absolute certainty of it, radiated from him like heat from a forge. Hale's hand trembled on the pistol grip. He looked into Boone's eyes and saw something he had never encountered in all his years of manipulating and threatening and buying his way through the world. He saw a man who was not afraid, not angry, not desperate, simply immovable, a mountain in human form. Hale dropped the pistol. It clattered on the rocks and slid toward the edge of the trail. Marshal Taggart's deputies closed in from behind. It was over. Lenora was standing on the porch when the riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. She counted them the way a woman counts heartbeats when the heart that matters most is not her own. 1, 2, 3, 3, Kincaid brothers, all upright in the saddle, all coming home. She ran. She was a dignified, well-mannered woman from Columbus, Ohio, educated in proper deportment and social graces, and she gathered her skirts in her fists and ran down the road like a girl, her hair coming loose from its pins, her heart so full it could not possibly contain what she was feeling. Silas saw her. He spurred his horse forward, swung down before the animal stopped and caught her. She buried her face against his chest and breathed him in. Dust and sweat and horse and leather and the smell of gunpowder and the scent of the man she loved. "It is over," he said into her hair. "Hale is in federal custody. Redmond too. Marshal Taggart is taking them to Denver for trial. You are safe. All of you. All of us. Everyone." Victor Hale stood trial in Denver that autumn on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to robbery and murder. The trial was a sensation. A wealthy, well-connected businessman exposed as the architect of a criminal enterprise that had terrorized 3 territories. He was convicted on all counts. 20 years in federal prison. Cyrus Redmond hanged in November. Lenora did not attend either proceeding. That chapter was closed. She had a ranch to run. The seasons turned. Lenora's first winter on the mountain was the hardest and the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced. Snow fell in November and did not stop until March. The drifts climbed to the windowsills and then above them. The creek froze solid. The road to Ridgercross became impassable for weeks at a time, and the world contracted to the ranch house and the barn and the short, brutal distance between them. Silas chopped wood every morning before dawn, the sound of the axe carrying through the frozen air like a metronome marking the rhythm of their survival. Lenora cooked venison stew and cornbread and learned to make the particular kind of thick, dark coffee that mountain men drank when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind came off the peaks like a knife. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Lenora reading aloud from the books on the shelf, while Silas listened with his eyes half closed and his hand resting on her knee, a gesture that had become as natural and as necessary as breathing. His nightmares did not disappear. They never would, not entirely, but they eased. Lenora learned to recognize the signs, the restlessness that preceded the dreams, the way his hands would clench on the quilt. On the worst nights, she simply held his hand in the darkness and waited. She did not try to fix what could not be fixed. She just stayed. Merritt took on a larger role in the community, winning a seat on the Territorial Commission where his charm and his intelligence found their proper outlet. He began courting the school teacher from a neighboring town, a woman named Ruth, who saw past his easy smile to the depth beneath and loved what she found there. They married the following spring in the same church where Silas and Lenora had exchanged their vows. Boone's arm healed fully, though the scar remained a white line across his bicep that he wore without self-consciousness. He took over much of the daily ranch operation as the herd grew, and his gift for gentle, patient horsemanship attracted clients from across the territory. Ranchers brought him horses that no one else could break, and Boone broke them the way he had learned to approach everything since Lenora's arrival, with patience and presence, and the understanding that trust could not be forced. Agnes remained at the ranch. She was family now in every way that mattered. She had earned that place 5 years before Lenora arrived, and nothing, not age, not weather, not the passage of time, could diminish it. Silas built Lenora a bookshelf. He did it in secret, working in the barn after the household was asleep, planting the timber by lamplight, fitting the joints with the same meticulous care he brought to everything he built. He installed it in the corner of the main room on a Tuesday morning while Lenora was gathering eggs, and when she came inside and saw it, she stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. "You gave up everything to be here," Silas said. "I wanted you to know that everything includes space for the things that matter to you." Books arrived by stagecoach from Denver, after that one or two at a time, and the shelf filled slowly the way good things always fill, with patience and intention and the quiet accumulation of days. In October of their first year, Lenora realized she was pregnant. She told Silas by the creek, their place, the place where he had proposed, where they had held hands in the dark, where all the important words between them had been spoken. He was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. Then he swept her into his arms and held her with a fierceness and a tenderness that seemed to occupy the same space that seemed to say, "I am terrified and I am overjoyed, and these two things are not contradictions. They are simply what it means to love someone this much." "A family," he said. "We are going to have a family." "We already are a family," Lenora replied and pressed her forehead against his. "This just makes it bigger." The baby came in the spring on a morning so bright it seemed the sun itself was celebrating. A girl, dark hair like her father, blue eyes like her mother. They named her Margaret after Lenora's mother, and when Silas held her for the first time, his scarred, calloused hands impossibly gentle, around that tiny body, Lenora saw tears on his face. The tears of a man who had spent years believing he would never have this and could not quite believe it was real. Agnes claimed the role of honorary grandmother with an authority that permitted no appeal. Merritt declared himself the favorite uncle before the child was a day old. Boone held Margaret with the exquisite care of a man handling something infinitely precious, and whispered so quietly that only Lenora heard, "I am going to teach you to ride before you can walk. Do not tell your mother." 2 years later, a son. They named him Thomas after Silas's father, who fell at Gettysburg. The ranch expanded. Lenora planted an orchard of apple and cherry trees on the south-facing slope behind the house, and she took up beekeeping, the skill she learned from the Henshaw ranch wife, and within 2 years, Kincaid honey was the most sought-after item at the Ridgercross general store. The years accumulated the way snow accumulates on the peaks, layer upon layer, each one adding to the depth and the permanence of what had come before. Margaret grew into a bright, fearless girl who followed her father across the ranch, asking questions he did not always know how to answer. Thomas was quiet or bookish, drawn to the shelf of volumes that had become Lenora's library, and when he sat in the corner, reading with his mother's blue eyes moving across the page, Silas would watch them from the doorway with an expression of such profound contentment that Agnes, passing by, would mutter, "About time," and keep walking. 25 years after Lenora stepped off a stagecoach into the unknown, she sat on the porch of the house Silas had built and watched the evening settle over the valley like a benediction. She was 49 now. Silver had found its way into the honey blonde hair that Silas still loved to see loose around her shoulders in the evenings, when the work was done and the lamps were lit and the house was full of the sounds of living. Her hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a woman who had built a life out of raw material and was not finished building. Silas sat beside her, 68 years old, slower than he had been, the years in his joints and his back, but still tall, still broad, still carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who had earned his place in the world through work and honor and the daily choice to show up and do what needed doing. The scar on his jaw had faded to a thin white line, like the nightmare still present, but no longer defining. Margaret was 24 now, tall and strong, with her father's dark hair and her mother's will. She was in the yard teaching her own daughter, their first grandchild, how to gather eggs without getting pecked. The little girl was failing magnificently, and her laughter rang across the property like bells. Thomas, 22, was mending fence with Boone, who at 58 moved more carefully than he once had but still broke horses every morning and still carried himself with the coiled energy of a man who had learned finally that stillness was its own kind of strength. Merritt and Ruth lived on a neighboring spread 3 miles east, and their voices carried on the evening wind, mixing with the sounds of the creek and the horses, and the particular hum that a well-loved piece of land makes when it is settled and at peace. Agnes sat in her rocking chair by the door. 81 years old, too frail to work, but too essential to leave. She was telling Margaret's daughter a story, and the story was about a young woman who came to the mountains with nothing but a trunk and a prayer, and found everything she ever needed. Your grandmother, Agnes said, was the bravest woman I ever knew. Brave enough to run when she needed to, and brave enough to stay when she found something worth keeping. Silas reached for Leonora's hand, and she gave it, and the gesture was so familiar, so practiced, so perfectly worn into the shape of their lives that neither of them thought about it anymore. It was simply what they did, what they had always done, what they would always do. Do you ever regret it? Silas asked. He asked sometimes, not from doubt, from wonder. The magnitude of what they had built still astonished him, still seemed too large and too good to be the work of two ordinary people who had once been broken. Lenora thought about the question the way she always did, seriously and with the full attention it deserved. No, she said, not for one moment, not for one single day. She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the stars appear. One by one, then dozens, then thousands scattered across the sky like a promise that had been kept. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived, terrified, running, alone, clutching a crumpled advertisement and $12.30 and nothing else. She thought about Agnes, who saw something worth saving in a desperate letter from Ohio and set the wheels of everything in motion. About Merritt, who taught her that laughter could coexist with grief. About Boone, who taught her that strength was not always loud and fast, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply not move. About Silas, who showed her that the deepest love was not built from grand gestures, but from the daily, ordinary, extraordinary choice to be present, to be honest, to be kind, to stay. Thank you, she said. For what? For giving me a home, for giving me a family, for making me believe that running could end somewhere worth standing still. Silas pressed his lips to her hair. You did not stop running because of me, Lenora. You stopped because you finally realized you were strong enough to stand. The creek whispered over its stones. The mountains held their ancient watch. Agnes's voice drifted from the porch, still telling the story, still shaping it into something the granddaughter would carry forward and tell her own children someday. And Lenora Kincaid, who had once been Lenora Winslow of Columbus, Ohio, who had once been a girl with nothing, who had once believed the world offered her no choices worth making, closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her family breathing and living and being, and knew with the certainty of a woman who had earned every good thing she possessed that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Sometimes being stranded was just another word for arriving. Sometimes the greatest love stories did not begin with love at first sight, but with an advertisement in a newspaper answered by a woman who had nothing left to lose. And sometimes 3 mountain men and a sharp-eyed housekeeper were exactly what one brave woman needed to discover that she had never been lost at all. She had just been finding her way home.